The evil of the Daleks is, in a way, the end of an era on Doctor Who. I mean, it's not really seen that way, generally you'd put the whole black and white era in one era, but it was very much a moment of change for the series. The series had been catapulted into fame and pop culture relevancy by the Daleks. They'd been the driving force to make Doctor Who a cultural icon, even at this point. Evil is the point at which this ended. The Daleks wouldn't appear for another 5 years, and they would no longer be the crutch the series could lean on. For the remaining years of the 60s, the show would need to stand on its own merits, and not just those of the Daleks. And yet perhaps not. All that really happened was that the show just decided to lean on the Cybermen instead, and while the next 2 seasons have several top quality stories, certainly far more hits than misses by a long shot, ultimately the formulaic nature of Season 5, and a tired feeling of much of Season 6, ultimately led to a decline that led to the show being retooled for the colour era, which is probably the point at which it was finally able to escape the shadow of the Daleks. When the Daleks did return, they did as the most popular and enduring villains of the Doctor, but no more so than that. In a way, the whole of 60s Who was dominated by their success, and his attempt to escape it perhaps was not as successful as they would have liked. But I digress. On its own merits, Evil is a well thought out and well produced piece that brings together a compelling narrative and some strong character work. It's nothing like as good as a Power of the Daleks, and the pretty simple answer as to why that is because it's at least an episode too long, and much of it suffers as a result. The central ideas and beats of the story work rather well, but the padding bits mostly don't. While Power is tight, and that was a big reason why it succeeded, Evil is not, and is in why, in my view, is no doubt the inferior of the two. Nevertheless, the exploration of character stuff, and more importantly, the exploration of the idea of what it is to be Dalek, this stuff is effective and does elevate the story. Before we get to all that though, any discussion of this story cannot take place without first exploring the background of why it was made. The enormous success of the Daleks meant that Terry Nation, ever looking to expand the reach of his creations, and the size of his bank account, began looking to sell to the US. America was one of the few places Doctor Who had not been sold to, mostly because it had a much earlier transition to colour than elsewhere, and black and white programmes were not of much interest as a result. It was also because of various political reasons US stations were frequently wary about buying foreign material. While Doctor Who would eventually become fairly big in the US, this was through the strength of Pertwee and Baker stories rather than the 60s as was in places like Australia and New Zealand. Therefore, to get the Daleks into America, they needed to be in colour and in a series specially tailored to the American market. Therefore, Nation decided to begin to develop a series involving the Daleks for the American market. Development and ultimate failure of this series is a story for another time, but the short version is that the Daleks needed to be written out of Doctor Who in order for this series to be a viable prospect. Thus, the evil of the Daleks was intended to be the end of the Daleks in Doctor Who. It's easy, of course, in hindsight knowing this was in fact not the end of the Daleks in Doctor Who, to diminish the importance of this. But given how important the Daleks had been to the show, this really was a huge event, and one that required skillful handling. Of course, the huge event story that you'd get in this instance today was not exactly a thing in the 60s, but a small-scale adventure would hardly be appropriate even then. This was not going to be the chase, it's fair to say. David Whitaker was brought back to write this story as well, presumably on the strength and success of Power, and bear in mind, not only did he have to write out the most important and successful element in the history of the show, he also had to transition to a new TARDIS team, with the departure of Ben and Polly in the previous story, and the introduction of Victoria in this one. So the task he had should be borne in mind when looking at this story. While the degree of change wasn't to the same extent as Power, it was nevertheless a fairly large shift. So that's the provenance of the story, with the Daleks off to become stars of American TV, and Doctor Who going in a new direction. As for what happened post-broadcast, this story in fact it has a bit of a milestone to it in that it became the first to be fully repeated. It was used to bridge the gap between seasons 5 and 6, with the ending of The Wheel in Space where Zoe gets shown the Dalek clip being what leads into it. It was a novel way of setting up to repeat, but hey, if it works, and I think it is in fact notable as the only story of the black and white era to be repeated prior to the 1980s. Slightly more typically for a 60s story, the archive status of the story also requires commenting on. Evil did sell slightly more widely than Power, but not by very much. The back end of Season 4 going into Season 5 was sold overseas during the hiatus on Dalek stories imposed by Terry Nation, for precisely the same reason this story was made, to avoid impacting on the creation of the spin-off series. This wasn't lifted until 1967, and thus the story wasn't readily available until 1968, by which point many countries had simply carried on with the series without screening this story. Australia was the first buyer, and in fact screened the story out of sequence between The Web of Fear and Fury from the Deep, which must have been a tad confusing for the viewers to see Victoria there, and then not there, and then there again. In fact, it might have been clever if it had been delayed until after The Wheel in Space to put it in the same place as the repeat on the BBC, but oh well. Anyway, it was also sold to Hong Kong, Singapore and New Zealand. The Australian prints were returned to the BBC, the Kiwi prints destroyed, and the other two countries likely sharing the same set of prints, the fate of which isn't recorded. But as usual, don't hold your breath for the answer being anything other than destroyed. In any case, by 1978 the entire story was gone from the archives. However, in 1987, a print of episode 2 was returned by a collector. Interestingly enough, it's reported that Terence Dix viewed an episode of the story in 1976 as part of the pre-production work for the documentary that eventually became Who's Doctor Who. If you have the DVD of The Talons of Wang Shahang on your shelf, you can watch it if you're interested. Based on his description, it's fairly likely it was the same copy of episode 2 that fell into the collector's market and ultimately back to the BBC, so there's an interesting story of how that got to where it is. So, we get one full episode, and of course a full set of telestamps on the audio. But, aside from some effect shots of the final Dalek battle at the end of episode 7, which may or may not be material from the finished episode, there's actually very little in terms of clips and so from the rest of the story, compared to the wealth of stuff from Power, but unfortunately that's how it is. As for how the story is affected by being missing, well, unfortunately I think this is way less easy to get into than Power was, for the reason that this is a story that depends far more on visuals and atmosphere, in a way that can never really come across from a reconstruction, and this is particularly the case during the middle parts of the story with Jamie's trials, and the final episode with the Dalek Civil War and all that. The loss of the visuals really do hamper what this story was trying to go for. Episode 2 was probably not one of the better ones to have. While it certainly has a few moments I'm happy we do have, the most important of which I'll get to later on, ultimately it's just more setup on top of setup, when the biggest problem the story has is poor pacing and much of it feeling like filler. It's also one of the least visual of the 7, but we have what we have and I'm happy we have it. I'd rather we have that than nothing. Anyway, like Power, Evil has been animated, and ultimately it's decent as the animations go. But again, like Power, I stuck with the official reconstruction on the DVD, which is actually really solid reconstruction for a few reasons. Firstly, like Power, you can select to have audio rather than non-text narration, which I much prefer for telestamp reconstructions. I'd rather have Frazer Hines tell me what's going on rather than having to concentrate on both the audio and the text on the screen. Secondly, it uses quite a bit of footage shot for the loose cannon reconstruction back in the 90s, which is the original house used for filming, which has a more dynamic feel to it. They have someone dressed up as Victoria and some original Daleks going around to add moving images to some scenes, which is really quite unique and adds a lot to it. It is, however, still nothing like as good as the original, which should win the no shit competition of the year, and unfortunately, given the weakest point of all the animations or when any complex action is involved, which the story has a lot of, that doesn't really do much either. So I'd sort of put us halfway between watching Master Plan and Power, not actively as difficult, but not as accessible either. Now we've looked at what you have to do to actually watch the damn thing, let's take a look at the story itself. Firstly, the director was Derek Martinus, who directed several 60s stories and also began the colour era of Spearhead from Space. You may remember Martinus being mentioned in the Mission to the Unknown review, although there wasn't really much to talk about there as the episode was missing, and here it's very similar. I couldn't tell you what his work was like for most of the 6 missing episodes, and the way episode 2 is set up means that anything other than a quite pedestrian directing style would have been pretty over the top, so it's kind of difficult to judge. From what we do have, I think his job was probably decent. There are some nice shots dotted throughout episode 2, focusing on the close-up of the Doctor when the Dalek reveals itself to him was a good move, for instance, and based on the audio of the performances, I think he does well with some of the character scenes throughout. So overall, I think his job was a good one, but with missing stories it's so difficult to tell it's not really a useful metric by most means. The rest of the production is more mixed. Unlike Power, this one has a full original soundtrack, done by Dudley Simpson. Simpson would of course become the show's regular composer throughout the 70s, and this is a good opportunity to talk about him briefly. While I do like a lot of his work, I think ultimately the over-reliance on him meant that the show's music at that period just became a bit stale. It just felt like the same sounds, the same instruments, the same melodies, the same safe sort of things, just over and over again. It just becomes a bit samey and boring and, as I said, pretty safe. Only when he broke out in the mould did his music really get as good as it could, City of Death being the prime example where the bold and beautiful Paris music really sets it apart from the same use of the same horns over and over again throughout most of the Baker era. Rarely is it at all bad, and I think if he had been used more sparingly it might have worked better, but ultimately I think the overuse of his music was to the show's detriment. What does this have to do with Evil, you ask? Well, his soundtrack for this story is, I think, a perfect way of representing this, because honestly I think the more crude electronic music from the first Dalek story that was reused in Power was far more effective for the atmosphere they were going for in that story. There are some good moments for it here. When Kennedy is killed by the Dalek in the episode 1-2 cliffhanger, the pounding theme playing there is extremely effective in setting up the tension and the dread, but throughout most of the story the samey, quite sedate Simpson music just doesn't do the job it needs to in setting up the right atmosphere. The sharp tension needed just isn't there. What would work so effectively in Power is just missing here and is a shame. As I said, Simpson did some great music. Hell, when we get to Genesis of the Daleks, I'll have nothing but praise for him. And there's sure as hell much worse, such as the god-awful Carrie Blyton soundtrack we'll see with Death to the Daleks. Simpson never got as close to as bad as that, but ultimately I think something with a bit more punch and tension was needed, and we don't get it here. In terms of production design, it's also a mixed bag, as most of the story is set in a house, which was a location shoot. There wasn't a great deal for them to do. The most notable set is that of the Dalek city on Skaro, which is a notable step down from how it appeared 4 years earlier in the first story. The cold, sterile, sleek corridors replaced by black drapes and some metal arches. It's definitely not as good. However, the design for the Dalek Emperor is one of Doctor Who's great design triumphs. This thing looks absolutely fantastic. It looks like exactly like it needs to, an evolution of the Dalek design, larger and more powerful, but also subdued and sleek. It strikes the perfect balance. I'm not sure why they even bothered with another design for the Emperor given the balance struck with this one, and the silly looking bulb-headed one in Remembrance and the overcomplicated New Who design certainly don't hold a candle to it. As for the rest of the production, well, I don't know because it's missing, so can't really help you there. If it gets found, I'll get back to you. Anyway, onto the script, and my looking at this is going to fall into two categories. The stuff I do like, and the stuff I don't. Let me know if that's a bit too overcomplicated. The biggest strength for this story is that it's a story based on character, and Classic Who was often at its strongest when it focused on exactly that. Here it's Whitaker taking the opportunity of the place Doctor Who was at this point, and using it as the central character dynamic of his story. Bear in mind we now look back on the relationship between the second Doctor and Jamie as one of the most successful Doctor-companion relationships in the show's history, but at this point when the story was being made, that wasn't really the case yet. Remember, Jamie was introduced at the last minute after they liked the character in the Highlanders, but that meant most of the stories in the rest of the season hadn't been written with him in mind. Thus, he was mostly just pretty peripheral to those stories, and when he was important, it was mostly just giving Ben even less to do. When Ben and Polly left the show in the early stages of the story before this one, the Faceless Ones, Jamie was for the first time the principal companion of the piece. And while that is a good story for him and does give him a lot to do, ultimately there's nothing there that with a bit of tweaking wouldn't have been impossible to see Stephen or Ben doing, which given Jamie's uniqueness as a character was perhaps playing it too safe. Remember I lambasted the production team on the Daleks master plan for wasting the opportunity they had with Katarina, and the last thing they needed to do here was waste the opportunity they had with Jamie. Whitaker wisely decided that developing and exploring this character and the relationship he had with the Doctor was going to be an excellent opportunity to give this story a solid centre to build on. Jamie was of course a companion from the past, so the concepts of anything more modern than the 18th century would be alien to him. But we quickly, and this was the strength of the character that had been present even when his roles were smaller, learned that he's able to adapt and learn because while he is not book smart in the same way the Doctor is, he's clearly intelligent in his own way, and therefore his cunning and ability to adapt made him an extremely effective ally despite that. Here he goes from fright at the flying beasties at Gatwick Airport at the beginning of the Faceless Ones to being natural enough in the modern world to be able to fit seamlessly with the chase of the TARDIS in episode 1 of the story, and Whitaker does a great job of integrating that overall arc. He builds on this throughout the story, as of course the main thrust of it between the 3rd and 6th episodes is the trials he's put through by the Daleks, where we see his skills and traits in action. He's courageous, resourceful and strong, but also capable of understanding and empathy, in the case of how his relationship with Kemel builds up. Because of his background as someone who comes from a war, but also someone who has learnt and grown with a Doctor, it's really a role only he could have taken on, and one he fits into perfectly. The way this becomes more complex though is that Jamie trusts his instincts and skills more and more. Those same instincts are telling him more and more to become less trustful of the Doctor. After all, he is acting in an extremely suspicious way in this story in how he's treating Jamie, and it is only natural for Jamie's instincts would turn him against those actions. It shows that it's time when the Doctor has changed him and made him more learned, but it has not dulled his instincts and his cunning. The story ingeniously presents this as a total understandable reaction on his part. While we know the reason the Doctor is acting as he is presented as more aloof and cold than usual, as if he's using Jamie, and we see perfectly why he's picking up the feeling that he's been abandoned by the Doctor. This is a fantastic arc throughout the story. He goes from trusting the Doctor as much as he ever would, to losing his trust and his faith for understandable reasons, then seeing it return through the Doctor's actions. Whatever the Doctor's odd behaviour can be, he realises he will always do the right thing, and begins to trust him more. It culminates when the Doctor tells them all to go through the arch in the Dalek city that had been used to turn Maxtible into a Dalek. It is Jamie who immediately trusts the Doctor that he's made it safe and leads the way. Playing on this relationship was an expert move from Whitaker, and shows he identified a potential in this character. Combined with Frazer Hines' performance, not least his chemistry with Troughton, this works as an extremely effective arc for Jamie. Well, the way the Doctor is set up by the story is also an extremely effective arc. As I said, we both completely understand his motivations and why Jamie becomes so distrustful of him. We get an idea of how the Doctor starts his journey through the story, through what I think is definitely episode 2's best scene, and one that I think makes having that episode exist overall worthwhile. It's in the one in the laboratory, when Waterfield and Maxtible are explaining the situation to the Doctor, who clearly suspects the truth but doesn't want to face it. Only when the Dalek comes through the time corridor and he's forced to face it, the look of dread and fear is perfectly captured. The mix of defiance and resignation that he has no choice but to help them is also a great setup for how things will go, and only when the Dalek has gone does the second Doctor's usual facade slip as he berates the two for how they have let it get out of control. Troughton's performance is masterful in this scene, of course. In a few small expressions he tells you everything, and the scene overall sets up the journey he goes through in this story perfectly. He works for the Daleks, albeit in a reluctant and unhappy way, and there's a scene I'll get to in a bit that perfectly encapsulates that. But he's also scheming and manipulating in his own way. Unlike usually, however, his manipulations don't work to plan, as the Daleks pull a bit of a fast one on him, which is a good shock to the system and a way of underscoring the Doctor's arc. Has he gone too far? Has he become too distant and immoral that he almost lost the companion and let the Daleks beat him at his own game in the process? The way this all comes together shows that there's nobody, not even his closest friends, that the Doctor is above manipulating and thinks it's the only way to win, and yet all of this is within the confines of a situation he for a long time has no real control over. He beats them, of course, through his own manipulations and creates a cap for an effective arc for him. He spends the story under the Dalek's power, and his journey is how to use both use that power to his own ends, and how to escape and defeat it, and how to get over the costs that might bring. It works very well, even separate from the effective relationship with Jamie, and I think this is a good example of why the second Doctor's manipulations work for me a lot better than the seventh Doctor's do. Because the second Doctor always knows that the relationships he has, such as in this story with Jamie, are the thing that matter the most, and that his manipulations, while necessary, also can't overcome the positive relationship he has. Whereas the Seventh Doctor just throws those relationships to the wind and uses Ace in a way that the Second Doctor doesn't with Jamie here. The Doctor clearly feels bad about having to do this with Jamie in a way the Seventh doesn't when he manipulates Ace like that. And I think it makes the Second Doctor feel more human and like a more positive character than the Seventh Doctor does. The scene I referred to a bit earlier is in episode 5, where he speaks with Waterfield. Waterfield's having second thoughts about the whole thing, and his guilt is clearly telling him apart. And in a brilliant moment, the Doctor dismisses these excuses. It's too late for it, he says. You've already got the Daleks involved, and we already are where we are. It's a brilliant moment where we see the Doctor resents being stuck in this situation, and is clearly just as torn up about the conflicting feelings as Waterfield is. He lashes out as a result, which shows a nice bit of humanity, for lack of a better word, that for all the obfuscating and manipulation, this Doctor is just as capable of the anger over the difficult decisions that he often faces. It's a great way of showing his feelings about the situation. He'll work for the Daleks, he'll use his companion, but he won't like it. And as I said, that's the contrast with the Seventh Doctor, who seems almost gleeful in his manipulations. The Second Doctor is anything but. Anyway, this is probably a good time to discuss some of the supporting characters, and when I say some, I say 3, because that's the number that are actually effective. Edward Waterfield works very well as a misguided scientist character, whose carelessness in this cost him everything. The way his guilt and desperation to return his daughter to him safely informs everything he does is effective, and as I said, leads to that effective scene with the Doctor where it comes to a head, and the Doctor chides him for having ever let it get this far in the first place. John Bailey does an excellent job of portraying him, with the weariness in every word he says working fantastically to underscore how broken this man has become. Now, obviously he has to die in order to allow Victoria to join his TARDIS crew, and I think his death isn't as effective as it should have been. Just pushing the Doctor out of the way of a Dalek seems a bit cheap, particularly when it's a Dalek blast suddenly having a catch-only part of the body feature it's never had before. Yeah, that wasn't new to the Stolen Earth, it's a thing here as well, and only so we can get his final words in before croaking. It feels pretty cheap and it doesn't really work. I think a death more directly saving Victoria would have worked better. After all, he gave everything for her and would make the ultimate sacrifice for her as well. But overall, this is a character that does work really well. A counterpoint to the Doctor almost. Being forced into working for the Daleks, one continues to scheme and fight, while the other simply capitulated. And yet his reasons were understandable, and faced with threats to the only remaining person who mattered to him, well, who wouldn't have done what he did in that situation? So yeah, I think this does work really well overall. Theodore Maxtible, the other scientist working with Waterfield, is an effective opposite number. While Waterfield is racked with guilt the whole time, Maxtible could not give less of a shit if he tried. While Waterfield does all of this and effectively gives his soul for his daughter, Maxtible's own daughter means nothing to him, and when the Daleks blow up the house, all he cares about is his laboratory rather than her fate. While Waterfield is disgusted with himself for what he's doing, Maxtible sees it as just a means to an end. Maxtible is, in fact, my view, another take on the Marvick Chen character. Not quite the same, of course, not least because Marius Goring's performance is quite subtle and low-key, effectively I should add, whereas Kevin Stoney's performance as Chen wasn't. But ultimately, it is someone who only sees what they want. Power in one form or another, in Maxtible's case the seeker of alchemy, transforming base metal into gold, apparently an obsession of Whitaker's and something he wanted to slot into a story, And he sees the Daleks as a means to get it, and like Chen, believes he's an ally and an equal, unable to see past his ambitions and wishes to see the Daleks' true nature. It's interesting that this was apparently something Whitaker was interested in, as he portrays the pursuit of alchemy as ultimately ruinous. It completely blinds Maxtible and eventually leads him to his doom. Maxtible was a cold villain, I think a superb counterpoint to Waterfield, as I said, and also the Doctor. The latter a reluctant collaborator, as opposed to how easily Maxtible was bought. This is another character that worked effectively in my view. Finally, there's Kemel the Turk. Now, given that 60s Who's record with racial sensitivity was not exactly stellar, one could be forgiven for approaching this with a bit of skepticism, but unlike other instances, like Topman and the Tomb of the Cybermen, Kemel I think is an effective character and one that is mostly quite tame when it comes to the race aspects. Yes, he's a hulking mute and Sonny Caldernez was Trinidadian, not Turkish, but the way the character is portrayed is actually rather sensitive. He's introduced as this savage brute, but importantly that's done by Maxtible, who clearly sees him as that, and obviously only because of his own bigotry. It quickly becomes apparent that Kemel is much more intelligent than he seemed, and how quickly he makes friends with Jamie, it becomes obvious he's just as cunning, smart, and empathetic as Jamie is. I think the idea of Kemel as this foreign brute is only something that's true if you see it through the eyes of Maxtible, a cold, unfeeling arsehole who cares only about himself. Kemel was also portrayed positively through his interactions with other characters, particularly Victoria, who considers him a close friend. There's a wonderful little scene in episode 6 where the two of them have been captured by the Daleks and have quite a natural friendly interaction as they try to encourage each other. So yeah, I think this escapes the racism trap that Tomb fell into at the beginning of the next season. While it's not perfect, this is a well fleshed out and human feeling character who we're clearly meant to see as just as important as all the other characters that surround him. The only downside I have is his death scene, where he just sort of gets killed by the Dalek-fied Maxtible and then forgotten about, with barely any reaction to it. Unfortunately, the way the story was structured meant that his death was sort of a necessity. There was no other way to get him off Skaro over on the TARDIS, and obviously that wasn't going to work. But having it essentially shoehorned in undoes a lot of good work in making him feel like a properly fleshed out character. But ultimately, it's a character I like, even if admittedly much of it rests on the assumption Caldernez's physical performance matches, which obviously we don't know because it's missing. I'll also quickly touch on Victoria, who was of course to join the TARDIS at the end of the story. A more detailed examination of her character is for another time, but despite the fact that she is a plot point rather than a character for most of the story, she gets a few bits to develop. As I said, her scene with Kemel was very effective, and Deborah Watling immediately fits into the role with ease. Ultimately though, she is simply a part of the plot, more a character existing to motivate Jamie and Waterfield, but she did get enough for future writers to build on throughout the next season, which they did, and ended up creating a fairly compelling character. Finally, the last bit I want to touch on in the good stuff category is the overall plot. While, as I get to, the pacing is badly off and there's a lot of padding, I think it does nevertheless build effective mysteries as the story goes on. It reveals just enough about what's going on at each moment to build up suspense and tension. The idea of examining the Daleks more closely builds on the work Power did, and it looks at what it means to be a Dalek, which while it's a silly thought that you can distill the behavioural traits of an entire species down to scientific fact, it's well done and underlines a lot of the assumptions about their society. Having the human Daleks was also a bold risk that could have ended up just becoming silly, but actually works really well because of how it's been set up. It seems obvious once it happens that the human Daleks should act human, but the way the Doctor had been dooming and how it had been talked about made it seem less likely. Their introductory scene, despite how silly the Daleks are acting, is actually kind of tense and creepy just with how it's done. The humanised Daleks themselves I also think were superbly done. They weren't just good Daleks, they were Daleks that had human traits, as you'd expect. The need for individualism, the think for oneself and to question, all ways of breaking the Dalek way of thinking. But notice, when the Black Daleks fires on one of the human Daleks that questions, the other human Daleks fire back and start fighting. You see other human traits there, the wish to avenge a fallen friend, and also the need for self-preservation. I think it works well in presenting a more complex human Dalek. You can't distill humanity down into simple traits like that, of course, but as far as you can take that concept, I think they did a good job of showing what a Dalek would be like when imbued with the right kind of humanity. So that's the good, what about the bad? Well, firstly, as I've alluded to, the biggest problem with the story is it is badly paced, and there is so much padding that drags the story down. The reason for this is obvious, 7 episodes was simply too much. 6 would have worked a lot better, but even cutting it down to 5 I think would have been a lot better by tightening it up and dropping off a lot of the superfluous plot elements. Although even doing that, I'd admit 4 may have been a bit of a stretch, and 5 is an unusual number, so they're a bit stuck there. 7 though, that definitely drags it out. Ultimately, there are so many plot points just designed to fill up space in the episodes that so much of the story just feels glacial. Episode 1 is a setup to a setup. The chase with all the robberies and through the cafe and all that, all the clues to get to the TARDIS, it's well thought out and I think it actually does work in places, but ultimately all it does is get Doctor and Jamie to the antique shop, which is where the actual setup for the story begins at the start of episode 2. The actual mystery in episode 1, as I said, it's alright, it does work, but it's so obviously just padding that its effectiveness is diminished. And once the Dalek shows up, you'll never think about any of it again, so what was the point? Jamie's trials then take up more or less 3 whole episodes, when frankly 1 would have done. While a lot of it is good stuff, the character stuff for Jamie and the development of his relationship with Kemel, it drags a lot, particularly as much of it is action that we can't actually see now and probably wouldn't have been that impressive even if it did still exist. It feels twice as long as it needs to be to get to the same character and plot developments, and in the end it drags down what does work about it, simply because it wastes too much time and drags too much. You in the end get bored even of the good stuff. And there's just a lot of pointless stuff as well. Jamie gets kidnapped at the end of episode 2. Why? Well, we literally never find out. The guy who was employing the kidnapper, Arthur Terrell, it will get to him, he's pissed at the kidnapper for doing it, and we never find out his motivations anyway before he gets exterminated. I'll tell you why he got kidnapped, because they needed the cliffhanger, and then they needed to fill out the first 10 minutes of episode 3. Speaking of Arthur Terrell, he's Maxtible's daughter's fiancé, and pretty much every scene with him, and Maxtible's daughter for that matter, is utter dead air that adds nothing. Arthur has the Daleks in his head, but we never found out how or why. It adds nothing to nobody's character or the plot, and it doesn't really create any atmosphere. It's just silly on the reconstruction with the distant Dalek voices, and probably would have been even sillier in the original episode. It's just padding. That's all it is. It's designed to stretch the story out, and is made all the more obvious by the fact that Arthur, the daughter, and the random maid we kept seeing, they just disappear from the story just before it moves to Skaro. They just leave in a carriage and presumably live happy ever after. Arthur seemingly recovering perfectly well from having the Daleks in his head. It just renders the entire thing completely pointless. And don't get me wrong, I know why it had to happen. They obviously had no place in the Skaro plot, they had to go, but it ignores the fact they didn't really have any place in the Victorian plot either. Maxtible's daughter is important, granted, she's an important part of his character as I said, to counterweight with Waterfield and how they feel about their daughters, but there's no reason she had to have more than a few establishing lines than to be sent away by Waterfield or something. Perhaps a way to show that Waterfield cares more for Maxtible's daughter than Maxtible does? In any case, that's all she needed, and Arthur's plot goes absolutely nowhere. It is just a complete waste of time. Thankfully, things are much tighter in the Skaro scenes, but this leads into my other big problem in the story. I don't really think this is a great story for the Daleks themselves. After how effective they were in power, there's no doubt this one is a letdown. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, we're back to them being defeated too easily again. At one point, Jamie and Kemel defeat one by just attaching a rope to it and then throwing it off the first floor balcony in the house. The idea that a Dalek can be moved by just throwing a rope around it and giving it a good tug makes them seem pretty weak and pitiful, and the idea that it will just explode after a fall that a human would probably survive creates the same feeling. It feels like a huge step down from how unstoppable and menacing they were in power. It also doesn't help that their plan is pretty convoluted and stupid. They set up the stupid, bizarre Batman gambit to ensnare the Doctor in their trap when they probably could have just kidnapped him and Jamie right there and then. They examine the human factor to find the Dalek factor doesn't really make any sense, and we never really get quite a sense of what their endgame is. Although it is a story necessity, and I did say the human Daleks were a strength for the piece, but how easily the Daleks in the city get defeated by the human Daleks don't help us either. The Emperor pathetically shouting, "Do not fight in here," is a bit of a letdown for his portrayal at least. The Dalek Civil War does not seem as climactic a battle as it should as a result. The Daleks do have their moments in this story, definitely. We're not talking the chase levels here. The scene where the Dalek exterminates Kennedy is extremely menacing, as is the one where the Emperor is introduced for the first time and shows how he's outwitted the Doctor. The voice work is also really good, probably the best it's been so far, but ultimately the Daleks' portrayal feels like a step down from how it was in the previous story. The menace and dreads, the feeling that they have outsmarted and outfought everyone, and they're just an unstoppable moment ready to tear through everything, that's all gone when one is defeated by a Scotsman, a Turk, and a bit of rope. They have their moments here, it just should have been more. Therefore, Evil is partially let down by those two elements. As I said, nothing like tight enough, and the Daleks themselves don't live up to expectations. Ultimately though, it does work. Partially because Whitaker's focus is on character and that's effective, but also because for what this story was intended to be, the Swan Song and the Daleks, I think it does work despite the issues with their portrayal. It explores a different side of them, and does naturally set up the climactic battle that would lead to the final end. It goes out with a bang, showing us more and bigger Daleks, exploring more about them, but also keeping so much of what made them a success in the first place. Of course this wasn't the final end, but when the Daleks did return, Doctor Who was barely recognisable compared to how it was here. The setting was different, the ideas were different, the themes were different. This might not have been the final end of the Daleks, but this was the final end of the era of the Daleks. They had catapulted Doctor Who to relevance in this country, and were now bowing out. Never again would they hold quite as much influence on the show, and how Doctor Who adapted without them would shape it for years and decades to come. The Evil of the Daleks is not an amazing story by any means, but it's an effective one, and brings the curtain down on this era of the Daleks in a satisfying way. Therefore, the final score for this story is 7 out of 10. While it's poorly structured thanks to it being stretched too thin, it results in a lot of irrelevancies and distractions, it nevertheless succeeds, thanks to its effective character work. The Doctor and Jamie's relationship carries the story, while the supporting characters add a great deal of depth to proceedings themselves. While it could have been better if it was tighter, it's nevertheless worthwhile thanks to these interactions and the efforts of the performance especially. I didn't love it, but I enjoyed it, and I think it was a worthwhile end to the Daleks' most important era. Which brings our look at the Daleks to the end of its first decade. The 60s shaped the Daleks. It introduced them, matured them, experimented with them, emboldened them, empowered them, and explored them. It took these fascinating creatures like nothing we'd seen before and turned them into one of the most popular sci-fi aliens of all time. The first story was a huge hit that catapulted them and the show into the national consciousness, but the way the production team that came and went kept them going, using them in new ways and adding more to their mythos. The Daleks entered evil as a fully rounded species, one in which many avenues of their being have been explored, and that in my view was commendable. Doing more with these creatures than just continually exploiting them, it showed a willingness for Doctor Who to grow and learn, to expand their greatest enemies just as much as they'd expand the show itself. 45 Dalek episodes were made in this decade, more than would be created for the rest of the classic era. And yeah, a large portion of them are missing from the archives, but that commitment and dedication to growing the show's most important enemies is plain to see just in that number alone. When the Daleks would return, with Doctor Who transformed, things would be very different indeed.